When I very briefly introduce each of our presenters in a few moments, you will note the rich diversity of our assembled guests. But I also have to acknowledge and want to acknowledge the groups and communities who will not be speaking this evening. Because we sought to have 3 speakers from each of the Abrahamic and First Nations traditions, counting Wendy Fletcher and myself, we were unable to include in our list of presenters several wonderful multi-faith organizations whose admirable work has done much to nurture a climate of interreligious respect. We also are honored by the presence of our friends and neighbors outside the Abrahamic and First Nations traditions. We could not have celebrated this event without inviting you. We look forward to working and learning with you as well. But we have to begin somewhere, and we recognize that our 100,000 volume library and our small faculty are largely rooted in the First Nations and Abrahamic traditions. Now, the children of Ibrahim and Abraham, whose different names for the same person suggest how we remember our ancestry in similar and different ways, have not yet learned to live in peace. While they've brought many gifts to this continent, they also brought disease and cultural genocide, the consequences of which occupy the thoughts and activities of the First Nations leaders here this evening, and many others among us as well. For these and other reasons, we decided that we had to commit to focus on healing and advancing the various Abrahamic and First Nations relationships from the very beginning. For this reason, we welcome the invitations of our friends in the Muslim Ummah to work with them to support programs to feed school children who cannot be fed at home by their families. The philosopher Len Goodman said that the good is the aggregate interest of all beings. He writes that peoples share not simply real estate, but pain and shame, hope and fear. And fear can cause us to pull away from each other, which is unacceptable in a world in which the problems that face us are so challenging. At Iona Pacific, we believe that simplistic, inflammatory, black and white, us and them, slogans and sound bites in response to complex, critical social problems are unlikely to lead to good social policy. We believe that serious, complex problems need to be addressed in all their complexity, or our children's children will still be talking about them. We don't claim that religious wisdom traditions and communities have the only answer to these questions. We have experienced much pain in our past. We are bearers of wisdom, oral and written, regarding the issues that tear apart our societies, and we wish to be a part of the conversation. We're not naive about the deep differences between our cultures, any more than about the differences between a physics textbook and religious scriptures. Each makes truth claims, but of different kinds. One is not better than the other. Meaning can be found in each, and interpretation is required for both. Failing to respect the complexities of our differences is as misguided as failing to seek the deep commonalities we share, as human beings breathing the same increasingly dirty air. We must learn from each other. The loss of cultural memory carried by elders within hundreds of indigenous peoples on this continent and beyond reminds me of what a Muslim scholar, Laviv al-Said, wrote of his experience in Cairo in the 1950s, mourning the erosion of cultural memory. He wrote, "Whenever I learned of the death of a famous reader of the Quran, I was deeply saddened, for I knew that the vocal treasures of the great readers were in many cases not passed on to successors, but were buried with them in their graves, forever lost. For this reason, we are so grateful that so many scholars and other elders of First Nations have taken the time from the vital work they do to enable their communities to survive, to be with us here this evening. We are deeply committed to seek partnerships with First Nations, seeking ways to support their leadership in addressing the crises in their communities. And this time, we will follow your lead." This evening, we are gathered in a 100-year-old, multi-denominational Christian theological college to inaugurate an interreligious center directed by a rabbi with appointments at the university next door, with our first intern, an Ismaili Muslim, enjoying kosher food, but with no alcohol, both out of respect for our Muslim tradition and out of consideration for those here who are recovering from addiction.
Well done.
We are joined by members of the Muslim Ummah, who were welcomed by volunteers, including several from a synagogue that was firebombed a few decades ago in Vancouver. We were welcomed to ancestral territory by a Musqueam elder, and shortly you will be greeted by several distinguished leaders. We have not done this merely to have a facade of multicultural diversity. Rather, the diversity of those who will greet you this evening, and the fact that nonetheless we are all assembled together this evening, goes to the very core of what Iona Pacific is about: respecting difference and bridging communities. This is why we invited our guests from the Muslim Ummah to use specially prepared rooms for their private prayers in our building at sunset, in accordance with the tradition of their community consensus. But it is also why we're not trying to promote a generic prayer experience for everyone this evening. I conclude with the words of Jean Vanier, the Roman Catholic philosopher, who asked, "What is it that we're frightened of? Because from fear and anguish can rise hate, and from hate can rise war." I would add that fear and anguish can also give rise to indifference, cynicism, withdrawal, and escapism. Vanier continues, "We must learn how to look into our fears, because we cannot let ourselves be controlled by fear. We have to look our fears right in the face, and we can't always do it by ourselves. We need to be helped, because if we can't look death and failure in the face, well, then we can never live, because to live means to risk, to do things, to have projects that might fail, that might go wrong. We have to decide to go forward and to risk things. Please join us in inaugurating Iona Pacific Center, a risk that we dare not fail to take."